Richard Thomas stepped into American living rooms as John-Boy Walton, and from the very first episode, audiences felt as if they already knew him. Gentle, thoughtful, steady, he became the quiet spirit, holding an entire fictional family together. Viewers saw him as the heart of the Waltons, yet behind that glow of affection, he carried a private struggle few noticed. He smiled for the cameras, still wondering how much of his young life belonged to himself and how much now belonged to the world watching. As the series became a cultural landmark, the weight on his shoulders grew. Millions saw their own sons in him, their hopes, even memories of a simpler time. That love was powerful, yet it demanded more than anyone could fully understand. Not yet 25, he had become a national symbol of goodness and stability, a role leaving little room for missteps, growth, or quiet moments of being unknown. Fame wrapped around him like a warm blanket, comforting yet isolating. The truth behind his refusal to return was never anger or ego. It came from a human place shaped by pressure, identity, and the cost of being loved by millions before he truly knew himself. Only now, after all these years, do we finally understand what pushed him away from the character that made him a star. Richard Thomas did not stumble into the world of acting. He grew up in it. His parents were performers. His childhood spent in backstage corridors and rehearsal rooms where dreams were shaped through discipline. By the time he reached his early 20s, he already understood the weight of responsibility that came with being a working actor. Yet nothing prepared him for the day. The Waltons premiered in 1972, and his life changed in a single season. As John-Boy, he embodied sincerity so naturally that viewers believed they were witnessing a piece of their own past brought to life. That connection felt tender and meaningful, but it also came with an invisible price that he had never been taught to pay. The rise was swift. Letters flooded in from families who saw him as a beacon of hope during a decade marked by change and uncertainty. Richard felt honored. Still, he could not ignore a growing tension within himself. The more the world embraced John-Boy, the more he felt his own identity fading. He poured truth into the role, letting his own gentleness and introspection shape the character. Yet the deeper the bond became, the harder it was to separate where Richard ended and John-Boy began. Fame, especially the affectionate kind, often wraps itself around a young actor so tightly that it becomes difficult to know which parts belong to the character and which belong to the person underneath. The schedule added another layer of pressure. Week after week, he delivered performances that demanded emotional sincerity, often drawing from personal corners he rarely showed anyone. The crew saw a professional, the audience saw a cherished son, but Richard felt something else building beneath the surface. He was grateful for the role. Still, he sensed that the comfort of being John-Boy was slowly turning into a boundary he could not move beyond. Every script reminded him of the innocence viewers expected from him, an innocence that did not always match the reality of a young man navigating adulthood. That quiet friction grew with each season, widening the space between who he was becoming and who the audience believed he should remain. What made the pressure even heavier was the way America embraced the Walton family as if it were their own. Mothers wrote to him describing how his voice reminded them of lost loved ones. Veterans shared memories of hardship and hope that mirrored the show's setting. Families tuned in each week to watch John-Boy carry the weight of responsibility with grace. That affection was beautiful, yet it left Richard feeling as though he could never disappoint those who saw him not as an actor, but as a living reminder of values that felt sacred. The more beloved he became, the more he feared that choosing his own path would betray the very people who supported him. Still, the truth continued to grow. Playing John-Boy felt like both a blessing and a prison. He loved the craft, loved the storytelling, but he also felt confined by a role that the world wanted to freeze in time. The emotional cost of that confinement became harder to hide as he matured. The question that lingered, even in his quietest moments, was simple but heavy. When did the burden become too heavy to carry? The long days on set were something Richard Thomas had accepted from the beginning. Television in the early 1970s demanded a pace that left little room for rest, and The Waltons was no exception. Episodes were filmed back to back, each requiring hours of emotional focus, each asking him to channel the same warmth and earnestness that defined John-Boy. At first he found purpose in the intensity, believing that the work itself was a kind of calling. Yet as the seasons passed, the schedule began to take more than it gave. The days blurred into one another, and the character who once felt like a gift slowly became a full-time companion he could never set down. Richard felt the strain most during the moments when life outside the studio called to him. Friends moved, careers shifted, relationships deepened or faded, but he remained anchored to the mountain backdrop of the Walton home. Birthdays came and went. Holidays were shortened or lost entirely to production demands. He watched peers explore new artistic paths, choosing roles that challenged them in ways he had once dreamed of pursuing. The creative limitations of playing the same character year after year began to grow heavier. He loved John-Boy, but the boundaries of the role left little space to stretch or evolve. Every script reminded him that the world expected a familiar innocence from him, even as his real life grew more complex. There were times when he would finish a long day of filming and sit quietly in his dressing room, still wearing the clothes of a character who felt more real to the public than the man himself. Those moments held a particular sadness. He felt the weight of time slipping by, the kind of time that a young man rarely realizes is precious until it begins to disappear. He saw friends starting families, taking risks, stepping into adulthood with a sense of freedom he struggled to recognize. Richard, meanwhile, remained tethered to a role that offered stability but limited personal growth. It was a quiet pain, the kind that does not announce itself loudly but settles in slowly, one missed milestone at a time. The breaking point did not come in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it arrived through a series of small realizations that gradually gathered into something undeniable. He noticed that he no longer looked at his call sheet with excitement. He found himself longing for roles that would challenge his abilities, roles that would allow him to explore characters with flaws, shadows, edges. He recognized that his world had narrowed, and with that recognition came a deeper truth. The person he was becoming no longer fit inside the frame of John-Boy Walton. The tension between who he needed to grow into and who the audience needed him to remain became too great to ignore. The moment he realized he was losing parts of himself came quietly, during an afternoon on set, when the cast filmed a family scene filled with warmth and unity. The cameras captured laughter, closeness, the kind of togetherness that had come to define the show. Yet, as the director called cut, Richard felt an unexpected emptiness settle over him. It was not the story that felt false, but the way the character's life seemed to move forward while his own felt paused. He understood then that continuing on the same path would cost him more than he was willing to give. Staying meant sacrificing the pieces of identity he had barely begun to form. As he sat with that realization, a new question surfaced. One heavier than all the rest. What truth about his life forced him to make the hardest decision of his career? Richard Thomas had always believed that acting was more than performance, it was growth. Every character offered a chance to explore new corners of humanity, to test the emotional reach of a young artist who wanted to understand life in all its shades. Yet, as the seasons of the Waltons unfolded, he realized that the role of John-Boy, as beloved as it was, left little room for the evolution he craved. The sadness of that truth settled in slowly. It was difficult to resent a character who had given him so much, but it was just as difficult to ignore the quiet yearning for something more challenging, something that reflected the man he was becoming rather than the boy the world saw. He carried that inner conflict with the kind of care only a thoughtful person can feel. He valued the responsibility of portraying a character that millions adored, still he began to see the cost of staying. Each season reinforced the same rhythms, the same emotional notes that audiences expected and cherished. But Richard knew that remaining in that space would limit his artistic future. He wanted to explore roles that allowed complexity, conflict, even discomfort. He believed that truth in storytelling came from growth, and he feared that staying too long in one role would keep him from discovering what he was capable of. It was not dissatisfaction, but a deep respect for the work that made the decision so painful. The moment he admitted this truth to himself carried a sense of grief. He understood that stepping away would disappoint fans who felt personally connected to John-Boy's journey. He also understood that his departure would reshape the series, leaving a noticeable gap in a family that had become part of the cultural fabric of the 1970s. Walking away meant letting go of a home he had built with castmates who had become like family. Yet he also recognized that staying would mean sacrificing parts of his own growth, parts he could never get back once those years were gone. In that realization lived the heart of his decision. He refused to continue playing John-Boy not out of anger or rebellion, but out of honesty and self-preservation. He knew that remaining in the role would keep him anchored to a version of himself that no longer reflected his truth. He needed independence, the chance to make choices based on artistic curiosity rather than expectation. The desire to grow as an actor, to explore new stories, became stronger than the fear of stepping into uncertainty. He chose to honor that calling, even though it meant walking away from a character that millions saw as irreplaceable. There was a quiet dignity in the way he approached his exit. He accepted the emotional weight of his choice, recognizing that every meaningful path demands sacrifice. He left at a time when the show was still adored, knowing that the legacy of John-Boy would remain intact. In that sense, stepping away was also an act of protection. He allowed the character to exist in a space of innocence and memory, without stretching it into something that no longer fit. As he watched the series continue without him, Richard entered a new chapter, defined not by certainty, but by courage. His departure marked the beginning of a long journey toward artistic independence, one that would test him in unexpected ways. Yet the question that lingered, shaping the next part of his story, was both simple and profound. What happened after he walked away, and how did it shape the man he became? Stepping away from the Waltons left Richard Thomas standing at a crossroads that felt both liberating and frightening. For years, his identity had been intertwined with John-Boy, a character who had come to symbolize sincerity and hope during a changing era in American television. When he walked away, he carried not only the weight of his decision, but also the uncertainty of who he might become without that familiar anchor. The emotional aftermath unfolded slowly, in quiet moments when he wondered whether the audience who had embraced him so warmly would follow him into unfamiliar territory. The early years after his departure were marked by exploration. Richard chose roles that challenged him, roles that demanded emotional depth and complexity, beyond the gentle idealism of Walton's Mountain. He took on stage work, returning to the discipline that had shaped him as a young performer, and he pursued roles in television and film that allowed him to reach beyond the boundaries he had once felt confined by. These choices revealed his determination to rebuild his artistic identity piece by piece. Yet with each new project came a reminder of the expectations he had left behind. Critics often compared his work to his time on the Waltons, and some viewers struggled to see him as anyone other than John-Boy. The criticism carried a sting, but it did not break him. Richard understood that leaving such an iconic role meant carrying the echoes of it wherever he went. Still, he also recognized that the discomfort of being misunderstood was part of the process of growth he had longed for. This period demanded resilience, the kind that develops only when a person chooses the harder path because it aligns with a deeper truth. Through the shifting landscape of opportunity and scrutiny, he found a quiet strength rising within him. It was not loud or defensive, but rooted in the confidence that he was honoring his own evolution. As the years unfolded, that strength allowed him to create a career defined by range rather than repetition. He embraced dramatic roles, complex characters, and challenging theatrical performances that showcased the depth many had not yet seen. Each new project affirmed the freedom he had gained by stepping away from the safety of Walton's mountain. He grew as an artist, and in time audiences began to appreciate the breadth of his talent. The redemption in his journey did not come from replacing John-Boy, but from proving to himself that he was capable of far more than a single beloved role. There was also a personal redemption that emerged slowly, shaped by maturity and distance. As he looked back on his early years, he came to understand that his departure had protected not only his career but also his sense of self. He had chosen growth over comfort, truth over expectation, and authenticity over familiarity. Life after John-Boy became a testament to the strength that can emerge when a young actor chooses honesty over ease. By honoring his own needs, he created a life and career that reflected who he truly was rather than who he was expected to be. Stepping away gave Richard the freedom and truth he needed, allowing him to expand rather than contract, to build rather than remain still. His journey became larger than one role, no matter how iconic that role had been. Yet one question remains as his story moves toward reflection. A question shaped by time, distance, and the quiet wisdom that comes from looking back on life's turning points. How does he look back on that choice today? With the passing of years, Richard Thomas reached a place of understanding that once felt impossible during the height of his struggle. Time softened the sharp edges of memory, allowing him to look back on his early fame with a sense of peace rather than pressure. The distance helped him reconcile the two versions of himself that had once seemed at odds, the young man learning to grow, and the beloved character who reminded millions of family decency and a gentler way of living. The legacy of John-Boy no longer felt like a shadow, but a chapter that had shaped him in ways he had finally learned to embrace. As he returned to public events celebrating the Waltons, he began to feel something he had once been too young to understand. The fans who approached him were not simply remembering a television show, they were remembering moments from their own lives. They spoke of childhood evenings spent watching with their parents, of generational togetherness, of finding comfort in a story that mirrored their own memories of home. Richard realized that John-Boy had become a symbol not because of fame, but because the role carried warmth during a time when many viewers needed it. This clarity brought him a new appreciation for the character who had once felt limiting. He also came to understand that walking away had not diminished his connection to fans. Instead, it had allowed him to grow into a person capable of carrying that legacy with honesty. In his later interviews and appearances, he spoke of his time on the show with gratitude, acknowledging that the role taught him discipline, empathy, and the profound impact storytelling can have on those who watch. The distance between his departure and his reflection allowed him to see the full picture, not just the strain of leaving but the meaning of what he had created. What moved him most were the stories he heard from viewers who had passed the series down to their children and grandchildren. Their memories revealed something he had not fully grasped as a young man. The Waltons had become more than entertainment, it had become a ritual of connection. Families watched to feel close to one another, to revisit a time marked by resilience and hope. Richard began to see that his decision to step away had not erased his place in that legacy. It had preserved it. By leaving when he did, he allowed the memory of John-Boy to remain pure, unchanged by the demands of time or overextension. This reconciliation brought him a sense of redemption. He no longer saw his younger self as a man walking away from responsibility. Instead, he viewed the decision as an act of courage, a choice that honored both the character and his own future. He understood that fame is most meaningful when it aligns with personal truth, and that letting go is sometimes the only way to grow into the person life is quietly urging us to become. In the end, Richard Thomas finally understood that the significance of his journey was never found in the height of his fame, but in the wisdom gained from learning when to hold on and when to step away. His legacy lives in the hearts of those who watched him grow on screen, and in the quiet honesty of a man who learned that even cherished roles must eventually give way to life's larger story. The emotional closure of his journey reflects a truth that resonates with anyone who has ever been loved for something they eventually had to outgrow. Richard Thomas's journey with the Waltons is more than the story of a young actor stepping away from a beloved role. It is the story of a man learning to honor both the love he carried for his craft and the life he needed to live beyond the cameras. From the weight of early fame to the quiet strength he discovered in leaving, his path reflects the universal tension between duty and personal truth. Viewers remember John-Boy not only for his gentle heart and earnest wisdom, but for the way he made families feel seen, heard, and held together in their living rooms across America. As time softened the edges of that journey, Richard found a balance that allowed him to embrace the character he brought to life without sacrificing the person he had become. His story reminds us that stepping away from what we love can sometimes be the most courageous act of all, and that growth often comes from choices that are quietly painful, yet deeply necessary. In the legacy of John-Boy, we see both the warmth of memory and the power of truth. For more emotional stories, check out this video.